And thanks for coming out on, such a really horrible night to be outside. Tonight, what I want to do is to discuss what I call the reality interface. And the premise is that all of the information that we get comes through one of our five senses. Next slide. So your interface, you have five senses, and they're shown here. There's your sense of taste, smell, sight, hearing, and touch. Right? We detect light, we detect sense, we detect taste, we detect sound, and we feel things. So the interface, all of the information that you get ultimately comes from one of those five sources. Now, I would argue that there is another sense which isn't as well recognized, but it pops up in the literature periodically, and that is the sense of balance. Balance shares a lot of the hardware with hearing, but obviously you don't hear balance. So I would argue that that's another sense. Some people prefer a sixth sense, which is more esoteric, perhaps even metaphysical. I think it's got some three-letter acronym, ESP, but my cable system comes with ESPN, so I get that. Next slide. So what happens when we're confronted with reality? If we're going to talk about the interface, I want to start with three quick examples of how the interface works. Yes. So when you're confronted with this particular reality, a saber-toothed tiger, the reaction is very quick. There's not a whole lot of processing that happens in your reaction if you are faced with a creature like this. In fact, our brains have pre-built instincts to recognize animals that walk on all fours, have big shoulders, and whose eyes are on face forward, have this triangular-shaped nose and the scary teeth. So that we recognize those without having to think, and then we either fight or flight, or acquiesce. I would recommend flight if it's at all possible. So here's another example. Go ahead. This is a less intimidating example in some way, but it's sort of the opposite. If you're faced with this reality, and you probably won't experience a fight or flight mechanism, but you may be engaged. So it's very different, and it takes a different path through your brain when you process this information than it does when you process that from a saber-toothed tiger. Next slide. Go. And this is an interesting reality that falls sort of in between the saber-toothed tiger and the chess set. And we will come back to this.
Face forward.
So the next slide. So let me then, with that as introduction, let me posit a disclaimer really quickly, and that is neuroscience is a baby. It's baby science. My personal research background is in particle physics, which is perhaps the most mature of the sciences, because the hydrogen atom is a very simple thing. Physicists have an advantage that they tend to study things that are arbitrarily similar so they can be understood with great precision. The brain, on the other hand, is arbitrarily complicated, and so understanding it is extraordinarily difficult. So everything I say, I'm pretty sure that it's all current and up to date, though there are a few conflicts, and I'll try to point them out. So everything I say is current, but a lot of it is likely not to pan out. So some of the things that I say are not going to end up being true. But as far as I know, they are right now. And the other thing is, I'm going to exercise PowerPoint abuse, and I want to apologize for that. I haven't given this talk very many times, and usually I bring some notes so that I can write down everything, but it's dark, so I didn't bring my notes. So what I did is I stuck them down here, so you can try and anticipate what I'm going to say by looking at my notes, or not. But it is in the end unforgivable PowerPoint abuse, and I apologize for that. So next slide. Now we really begin. So what we're going to do is science. Okay. So I want to walk through this with you as scientists. And the first thing that a scientist needs to do is to define what they're talking about in as simple terms as possible. Unambiguous definitions are necessary to do science. I think that it's the primary reason that we use mathematics, and that we use mathematics with such tremendous success is that mathematically defined quantities are unambiguous. So we need to do the same thing as much as we can when we're using language. So for that, we need to define what we mean by reality and interface, and we'll see in a second, perception. So objective reality, I think that the simplest, bottom line, minimal definition of objective reality is stuff interacting in space. And the reason that it's kind of obviously minimal, right? Stuff interacting in space. I'm not even saying what the stuff is. I'm not going out on any limbs. But it does posit space and that there's stuff in it. And by interacting, that means that there's dynamics. So it also includes time. So this is a minimal definition of objective reality, but it presents a problem. The problem is maybe essentially philosophical, and I don't want to deal with philosophical problems, and so the way to get around that is to go a step higher and define something else that I don't have any trouble with, and that is objective reality, observable reality. I can only observe what I observe, right? And so that's the reality that I perceive. So for you, the definition of observable reality is your perception of stuff interacting in space. But it's an order of magnitude higher in complexity, but we have to deal with it to get anywhere. So that means we need to talk about what perception is. And perception is kind of an interesting thing because it is the association of a stimulus and thought. A stimulus, what I really mean by stimulus, is some external agent, some input from one or more of your senses that you associate with a thought, and the thought gives it perception. So the two are perception. Another idea along these lines is the notion of what an idea is. An idea is the association of a thought, and maybe more thoughts. But a perception, at least tonight, I want to stick with perception as association of stimulus and thought. Next slide. So here you go. Here's your interface. You got these 5 data acquisition systems here, and go ahead. And each one of them has a whole mess of different connections that go to your processor. All right? So there they all are, all 5 of them. They've got lots of wires. They go to your head. Go ahead. And the funny thing about these, and I don't want to introduce a whole bunch of jargon, because I think the nicest thing that one can do when talking about any arcane subject is to introduce as little jargon as possible. But I do want to mention the word neuron, right? And a neuron is a brain cell that has cables associated with it called axons. You don't have to remember any of these words, other than that the interesting thing about the sensory input is all of the senses come into the brain with essentially the same cables. So it's not too crazy to think of your brain being connected to your senses the same way that your TV is connected to the cable box, or your iPod is connected to that little plug-in, and then your earbuds go into your ears. That they're all cables, and if you plug them in wrong, well, then they won't work. So one interesting thing here, and a recent a theory that's evolved in the last couple of years, is this notion of the Darwinian theory of neural development, and that is that before you're born, in the first several months of your life, you have far more neurons and axons, way more of these cables than you do now, or than you did when you were 2 years old. And so it may be that in the course of the first few to several months of life, that we actually have to learn which of those cables get connected to which sense. So that if I see something and hear a sound, I need to learn that that's not the right connection. And by rejecting those connections, those particular wires will be disconnected, and essentially those neurons killed. But on the other hand, the different parts of the brain are tuned to handle different senses. And for example, most of the axons that go from the eyes into the back of the brain are there, to operate the machinery of vision. So it's an overlapping system. So next slide. But eventually we get everything sorted out and we get the right cables connected to the right pins on our processor and we're ready to go. Next slide. So that brings us to reality. So we have some idea of the interface, a definition of reality, but not a really functional definition. So that's what this slide is meant to be. Now, the time scale of existence for a human being is about 1 second. We really only exist in the present, and the present lasts in periods of about the time between heartbeats. If we did not have any past experience on which to base our perceptions right now, they wouldn't make any sense, right? We have to learn what to expect of the future to make sense out of the present. And the way we do that in our minds is we build models of reality. And this is something that I think is easy to demonstrate for yourself. If you just think of a human being that's not here. Everybody think of a human being that's not here. Okay, thank you. So your brain has just brought up a model of that person. And do you ever have a discussion with somebody who's not there? You think of, oh, I can't wait to tell so-and-so this and such. And I know what they're going to say, right? And that's you talking to your model of that person in your mind. And in fact, those areas of your brain that light up when you see that person are the same as those when you think of them. So we build models. It's the way we think. And part of the way we think is to categorize things, right? This is at once the most convenient and annoying thing about dealing with other people, is that they want to pigeonhole things, right? There's so-and-so, look, he's wearing that. Know what to expect there, right? So we do build expectations, but if we didn't, we couldn't make any sense out of right now. We'd be in big trouble. Next slide. So what I want to do now is introduce to you the brain in 3 oversimplified pieces. This is the much maligned triune model of the brain, and so I want to be careful with it because it really is oversimplified. The idea, it's useful, but we have to be careful with it, and I'll explain that as we go along. But the idea is that the brain evolved in basically 3 major stages. Next. And the first one is the brainstem, what I'm going to refer to as your inner lizard, your inner reptile. And at the bottom of your brain, right at the base of your neck, and a little bit behind, in the bottom of your head and back, is where your inner lizard lives. And your inner lizard takes care of simple things like, well, not simple, but those necessary things that you never really want to think about. Maintaining your heart rate, your body temperature, whether you're sweating, whether you are immediately scared of something, and also your territorial instincts. What is mine? Next slide. Your inner puppy, on the other hand, is the base of the mammalian experience, which is also called the limbic system. And your inner puppy is concerned with things like emotion. This is your gut reaction, anger, fear, affection, play, right? Anybody who's ever played with a dog realizes that they get joy from playing. They're not doing it to make you feed them. It's joy. This part of the mind is really about the emotions, including things like expression. For people, smiling. For dogs, wagging the tail. They dream. When they're surprised, you raise your eyebrows or your ears, if you're a dog. And then finally, is everybody aware of Richard Feynman? Personal hero of mine. Not even arguably the greatest American physicist ever. Dick Feynman. Next slide there. Next thing. And so your inner Feynman is the part of you. Yes, if we all had an inner Feynman to call on, well, we do to some extent. And that's the part of us, the outer shell of our brain, the most recently evolved part that does planning, calculation, deduces things, assembles complicated ideas. This is that does your quantum physics and makes complex decisions for you. Next slide. So here is what I want to do is I'm going to walk through the way that we respond to those first 3 images that I showed you. So let's start with the saber-toothed tiger. And here he is. So we are afraid. Go ahead. And the first thing that happens is, over here, our 5 senses, we see it, maybe we smell it, we probably hear it, and that information comes into the thalamus, which drives it to a thing called the amygdala. These are both actually part of both your inner lizard and your inner puppy. And what happens immediately is that you have a bodily response and fear. The fear goes to part of your inner Feynman, the forebrain, which is right above your eyes, in your head, and back in your forehead a little bit. But initially, your bodily response upon seeing the saber-toothed tiger is that you turn around and run like hell, right? And as you do that, that information is also, right, you feel the information from your legs and your heart beating and the terror and the adrenaline going crazy, and you're running, and that's more tactile input that goes back into your brain, gets shuttled to your amygdala and your forebrain, the further bodily response is to keep on running, and so you get this feedback loop where you respond, and then you respond to your response, and you respond to your response's response, and this all generates a reward for you. Now, if you turn and run, and you take 10 steps, and then you wonder, well, what am I really running from? You need a reward, and that reward is a sense of certainty. And that sense of certainty is handed to you by your inner Feynman, but automatically. Automatically, it is a trained thought response, and that comes back in as a sense to feed you a little bit of response to say, okay, I'm going to keep running, and I'm going to run until I get away or until I'm eaten. So, next slide. And all this takes about 0.2 of a second. 0.2 of a second is a human reaction time. All right, and then in some sense, if those of you who work with computers, 0.2 of a second, 200 milliseconds, 200,000 nanoseconds, it's forever. But fortunately, he doesn't react any faster than that either, right? Things balance out among the mammals. It's interesting that trees, they don't have that reaction time at all. So they have to find other ways to run away or grow thick bark. Next slide. So the chess set. Okay, this is kind of the opposite extreme, the opposite end of the spectrum of being faced with something. So go ahead. And so we get the same thing. We see it. We generate some bodily response. Probably our pupils get bigger to look at the board and to take it all in and hit that. And we generate an uncertainty. What move am I going to make? Right? I'm doubtful. What am I going to do? I need to do something, and what do? I invoke my inner Feynman because I need to make a move. And I don't know about you, but when I play chess, I'm one of those annoying guys that takes an hour to make every move. And the reason is that I have to think through, I have to gauge 3 moves in advance, every possibility of every move I could make, encountering every possible move you could make, and it takes a while. And what happens is the data comes in from my eyes and so forth, and I have to first recognize the image. I have to associate it with some memories of the memory of what each piece does. I have to recognize that and then associate it with possibilities, and then I make a choice. And all of this takes no less than half a second. And let's face it, if it takes more than 50 years, I'm not going to win this game. So go ahead. And when I finally make the choice, I get a sense of certainty, and that's my reward. And then I'm ready to move on to the next problem. after moving the chess piece. So in between, interestingly, in between is this case of choosing a president. You know that your vote, I find it personally very soothing to know that I'm only one of several 100 million people that vote, because I don't want all that responsibility. But there's two cases here, two sub-cases, if you will. It turns out, I don't know how reliable this statistic is, so probably plus or minus 30%, but that's close enough. It turns out that 94% of us look at this picture and we respond essentially the same way that we do with the saber-toothed tiger. And that is, we already know what we're going to do. And so I look at this picture, I know which one of these guys I'm going to vote for. I already figured that out a long time ago. So the image comes in, it generates a bodily response, which is complicated, much more complicated than that of the saber-toothed tiger, though less intense. And in about 0.2 of a second, I've already recognized, yeah, okay, I know where I'm going to put my dot. But 4% of Americans have a different way to go. They have to decide. So they have uncertainty. So they're going through this loop, and go ahead, as well as trying to think their way through the way you would. It's more similar to making a move in chess. Image reconstruction, try and figure out, do I agree with this guy, and actually listen to them, and then make the choice. So this falls in between. Next slide. And that'll take half a second or 2.5 months, or they're not going to vote. So I felt compelled, if I'm going to talk about neuroscience, to show pictures of the brain like this, though I didn't want to show one that's actually a real brain, because I'm not a biologist. Though I love biology, I just don't want to go into a biology lab. It seems so kind of gross, all that stuff in there with blood and things. But it's it can't be that theoretical. So here's a picture of all this stuff. Next slide. Oh, I should say something about that, shouldn't I? And okay, the thing I want to say about that is it's easy to think of from something like from here, the neck to the waist, as being a cavity where we store lots of organs that we acquire oxygen with, we generate energy, we get nutrition. We've got a whole bunch of maintenance stuff going on in here. The head is essentially, we should think of the head as a similar kind of thing that holds a whole bunch of organs. The fact that we call all those organs the brain is probably a misnomer. It's a whole bunch of different organs that have to work in concert very much, well, not very much, but in the same sense that all our internal organs that do the icky things have to work together. So for the next several seconds, I want to perform an experiment. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to listen to yourself, and we're going to spend about 3 or 4 seconds on each of the next several images, and I just want you to notice whether what sort of physical response you have, what your inner puppy tells you about these different things. If you get goosebumps, if they make you laugh or make you unhappy, or hopefully don't make you disgusted, though I risk that at some small level. There are no spiders in this presentation by special request. And the instant thoughts that we generate through this immediate association come in 2 different ways. They're either trained or they're built in. They're instincts, or some play between those two. And we have specific wetware within our forebrain, really at the bottom of our forebrain, right above the eye, is called this thing called the caudate nucleus that we train to make those immediate thoughts. Like when I look at the 2 presidential candidates, I know which guy I'm with, because I've trained that. And part of the problem with communicating with other people is that we've already trained ourselves to respond. So it can be difficult to penetrate other people's arguments. And that's one of the reasons I want to go through this. But also just to have you experience your inner puppy in some way. So go ahead. Next. Go. I used to roadie for this guy. Next. I am this guy. And finally, a fuchsia. And the reason I put the fuchsia at the end is because the fuchsia, for me, or all right, well, I should just ask, how many of you think of my grandma's house when you see a fuchsia? No one? No, there's one. I got a couple. Right on. So my grandma was had a major green thumb, and she loved fuchsias, and there were fuchsias growing all over her yard in Oakland. And so every time I see a fuchsia or smell one, I think of my grandma's backyard. That's a trained thought. It's an immediate response, similar to how a physical response is when you ride a bike. If you have to think about turning the wheel, you're going to crash. You need to feel it and know how to do it. Musicians experience this when, for example, playing a guitar. When I play a guitar, I have to count the number of strums, and I got to anticipate which fingers to put which strings on, and count the strums. And so if I'm actually trying to play a song, I can't listen to it because I got to work all this. I got all this stuff going on. I don't have time to listen to it. But a real musician has trained their mind to work with their hands automatically. Next slide. So these are the feedback loops. You've got your inner puppy, your inner Feynman, and this sense of certainty. Next slide. So the question is, how do we win friends and influence people? So this is what came up in writing my novel, The Sensory Deception, and because that's what they were really setting out to do. And from this model that I've developed, there's really one big problem with trying to convince somebody of something that they already have firmly held belief in, or even broaching the subject. In a state of polarization that our country tends to be in, this is a real issue. And the issue is right there. The inner puppy has already decided and is certain. The gut reaction is all there. So in talking to someone, trying to broach a subject upon which they already have a tightly held opinion, there's several ways to do it. One is to try to go around this shock and awe circuitry and get to the inner Feynman, get to the part of the person that is willing to think through and understand what the case is before coming to a conclusion and making a judgment. We have to make judgments. We have to predict or have expectations about the future, or the present doesn't make any sense. And the problem with that is that when we're faced with or when we want to talk to somebody who disagrees with us to understand what we actually disagree about, we hit this obstacle. And so to get to the inner Feynman, there's essentially, I'm going to try and do it in a minute, but there's another way to do it, and that is to retrain your inner puppy. And the way that you retrain your inner puppy is by going through and presenting a scenario right through as many senses as you can to build empathy. And that is kind of walk a mile in another person's shoes. But first, I'm going to do an example of, I'm going to try and go around your shock and awe circuitry. Next slide. So what I want to talk about now, I'm just going to do a little bit of science. And so this is water boiling on my stove at the house. And so this is the definition of heat capacity. A little bit of high school chemistry. Never hurt anybody. All right, maybe it hurt a few people. I don't mean to bring up any really bad memories. But anyway, so heat capacity, I think, is a really interesting quantity. The heat capacity of water is the amount of heat that is required to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree of temperature. You can tell whether something has a high heat capacity or a low heat capacity when you touch it, because something with a high heat capacity at room temperature tends to feel more or less at room temperature. Something with a low heat capacity is going to pull heat out of your hand and feel cold. So conductors, a piece of silver or gold or steel has a very low heat capacity. When you touch it, it feels chilly. So next slide. Air also has a heat capacity, about a quarter of the heat capacity of water. So air requires about a quarter of as much energy per gram to go up in temperature 1 degree. Next. And air is made up of a bunch of stuff, right? 78%, the vast majority of it is nitrogen and oxygen. There's a little bit of argon, harmless inert gas. There's a tiny bit of carbon dioxide, about 0.03%, and then a whole mess of trace things, lots of the inert gases and various pollutants and stuff. And each one of these has a separate heat capacity. Next. And the heat capacity of carbon dioxide is about 0.2. So it's about 20% lower than the heat capacity of air. And that means that carbon dioxide tends to heat up about 20% faster than air does when it's exposed to heat energy from the sun. Next slide. And here's another fact, that since 1850, human beings have burnt enough oil and coal to increase the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere by about 120%. And the carbon dioxide concentration has increased by about 35%. The discrepancy between these two numbers is pretty easy to hand wave and understand, because oceans and forests will tend to absorb excess gases. That initial mix is there for a reason. It's equilibrium, and since the atmosphere is reasonably stable, it's a buffer effect and absorbs that excess. Still, the carbon dioxide concentration is tiny. It's 35% higher than it was 150 years ago, but it's still about 0.03%. So, having tried to go around your shock and awe circuitry, go ahead, I pose the question, is human-caused global warming a reasonable proposition? Well, if I presented this argument the way that I set out to, then, which I don't think I really did, but if I presented this the way I set out to, you wouldn't know what my personal position was until somewhere farther along. And I was very careful only to present facts that I understand. Of course, I didn't present all the facts, because I don't have all the facts. These are the ones that I know. These are the top level of the argument to try to get around the shock and awe circuitry. Next slide. This is what happens if you go straight at the shock and awe circuitry. And I would pose that no one has a hope of convincing anybody else of anything by taking this sort of bumper sticker approach. Right? Essentially, this is an information-free slide. A little bit of sarcasm, some irony, a little bit of in-your-facedness. But this is kind of the problem that we face in communicating complex issues. Next slide. Because here's my bumper sticker. This is the argument that I presented. And I'm not going to have them printed up. I'm not. The problem with bumper stickers. So the next slide. So here's another way to go about the whole problem of getting around the shock and awe circuitry and engaging your inner Feynman. Since the way we perceive reality is by building models of reality and then fitting what our sensory input is into those models, and then modifying the models to fit the data and having that feedback loop. Another way to do it is to present a different case with data, right? To actually inundate the senses with an experience. Go ahead. And so this is, I think, a way that we're going to see more often for presenting arguments using virtual reality. Now, it's not new. This is the purpose of literature in some grand scheme, certainly philosophical literature, is that the difference, when I was a budding scientist and took some literature classes, Pearls Before Swine, I kept reading them and thinking, well, why the hell don't they just come out and say it? Why 400 pages? Just tell me, baby, I'm good. And the reason is that empathy, that you're not going to build any empathy just by laying out some facts, especially if they're bumper sticker style facts. But by going through, I mean, okay, who here doesn't like books that make them cry? Hate books that make them cry. You're crazy. Okay, there's one sane person in the whole place who doesn't like to read books that make them cry. Why do we like books and movies that make us cry? The welling up of emotion and the building of empathy is really, can be cathartic. Coming to a different understanding generates a new gift of certainty. And that is how new technologies can be used to present cases, to develop empathy for different causes. I don't really want to use the word causes, but to maybe break down the polarization that we experience. It turns out that the greater the intensity of the sensory input, the greater the empathy that's developed in the subject. And this is being shown in experiments in virtual reality labs around the country. There's a guy at Stanford, Jeremy Bailenson, who has a, and I tried to download this to show it to you, but I couldn't. And he's got a virtual reality program where you go in and you chop down redwood trees. And he's shown that by the people who experience chopping down a redwood forest firsthand use less paper. We'll see more of this as more virtual reality technology is developed. Right now, you go in to buy a new TV set. My TV set broke last month after 11 years of hoping. It finally died, so I got to get one of these wicked cool, huge TVs. But almost all of them have 3D. So you can put on the little glasses, and no longer is it like this, a slide, but things move, like in the movies, the 3D. That's an added layer of sensory input. Binaural sound is, we all know stereo, right? Stereo is 2 speakers. Surround sound, I think, is 5. And there's different ways to set the timing. And it's all trying to get to binaural sound. What binaural sound is, you have 2 ears. And if you hear a sound, say over there by the speaker, you can more or less point where that sound came from by the timing difference between the 2 ears. So that's what binaural sound does. And more technology that's already out is new video game technology, the Wii and the Kinect, which no longer do you sit there with a joystick, but when you're doing the actual guitar simulation, you're actually holding a thing that's sort of like a guitar and playing it. You're doing the tennis simulation, and you're standing in front of the little camera that monitors your moves. And this builds up a thing called the Proteus effect. And what the Proteus effect is, it's basically when you take on a role, you tend to believe it. So it's this trite saying that I've experienced to be true, which is if you're having a rough day and you force yourself to smile, and you say, I'm going to smile for 5 minutes, that no matter how ironic that stupid, annoying smile might feel at first, if you stick it out, things don't look so bad afterwards. So there's more of this coming. Next slide. And now I want to go back very quickly. This is an article that I saw in 2008 in the Chronicle that initiated my idea for the interface, the reality interface, and this novel I wrote, The Sensory Deception. So Iceland, a polar bear that swam more than 200 miles in near-freezing waters to reach Iceland was shot on arrival in case it posed a threat to humans. The bear, thought to be the first to reach the country in at least 15 years, was killed after local police claimed it was a danger to humans, triggering an outcry from animal lovers. Police claimed it was not possible to sedate the bear. 200 miles. So what came to mind was this image of a polar bear living on, icebergs and islands, and eating seals and fish, and swimming from ice floe to ice floe as they do. And since the ice is melting, I just had this image of this bear swimming along and just expecting more ice. And to go 200 miles takes 2 to 3 weeks swimming constantly, not a lot of time to sleep, and as all that energy is expended, they lose their buoyancy and start to sink, so it gets harder and harder. Then finally, it gets to Iceland and is shot. So the idea is, what happens in the sensory deception is that Farley Rutherford, your hero, decides to put human beings, to give them this experience firsthand in a virtual reality technology that inundates the five senses. And he does it, and it works, and so he ends up recruiting an environmentalist army. Trouble ensues. Next slide. So these are some other points that we didn't cover, and one is the reality of other animals. And animals that don't have language have a difficult time conceptualizing things. We use words in our own heads to come up with concepts and store memory. So there tends to be a much more immediate reality. Timescales are different. For dogs and bears, as an example, who use the sense of smell as their primary interface with the world, they operate on a different time scale. Where we use sight and hearing, both of which are very immediate. When you turn on a light or a sound and then turn it off, it goes on faster than 0.2 of a second, and it goes off faster than 0.2 of a second. But let's face it, scents linger. So for a dog, when they get a scent, they don't necessarily expect something to be there already. They expect that it's either coming or it's gone, but a different time, a different sense of time. For dolphins and whales and bats, who see rather than with their eyes, but by using sonar, they have a very different reality. And check this out. So when you look at something, if I look off in the dark, I don't see anything, right? Because there's no light reflected off anything for me to detect. When I look over here, I see Karen because there's some light reflecting from her. But when a dolphin looks at something, they project sound into the dark. The sound hits whatever's over there. It reflects back as echoes, and from those echoes, they build up images. So when they look, it's a much more active process. But check this out. Those sounds that they emit, they go into tissue. So when you put your hand in the water and there's a dolphin there swimming around, when it looks at your hand with its sonar, it sees the bones. It knows where the flesh is, and it knows where the bones are. Now think about how this would affect different societies, right? You're swimming around and you look over there, and not only do you know she's pregnant, you know an awful lot about what's going on inside all of your different friends and associates in your pod. A very different reality with sort of like X-ray vision. Then finally, there's kind of an obvious question that goes back to the initial definition I gave of reality, and that is there an absolute reality? Is there reality independent of your perception? And the answer is yes, but you'll never experience it. So what I want to leave you with, and don't flip the slide yet, but what I want to leave you with is this video that was taken in Cannes, France by, well, you'll see, but it's kind of as close as I could come up with off of the interwebs with any level of permission of how virtual reality can be built. And so it's the experience of another animal, though not a very complete one, but kind of an interesting one. Go ahead. So I think you have to hit it again. Yeah. So this is a seagull who's going over and picking up a GoPro camera. A GoPro camera is this unique, really intense camera with lots of software that makes images steady. So here he is flying over Cannes, and then he lands, and he puts down the camera right about here, and there he is, and he's had enough of it. Thank you very much for coming tonight.